well? Okay, so thank you so much, Vivi, for inviting me and for organizing this wonderful event. And it's a great honor and privilege to get to know Mark Graeber and his work more closely. So thank you for that. As we heard last night, the story of and read in the papers, the story of the 14th Amendment and the process of its codification is inter alia a story of kind of designing a facilitative device that favors or is meant to promote the interests of some political governing elites. I think this is really a fascinating topic on its own terms and within this specific American context. Yet what may seem this idea of what may seem prima facie as a constraint ushered by principles and values that is then triggered by internal processes and social unrest like the Civil War, and then again is utilized as a backdrop for those holding power to pursue political ends that are compatible with their interests. That particular story could be generalizable or could be found in other contexts. And the story I'll be telling today is actually about another codification process, not in constitutional law, but in international law, that in many respects, in these kind of very abstract general terms, is a similar story about about the role of political unrest in ushering codification that is perceived as something that is based on principles, but actually is there to pursue particular political interests and to curtail social unrest from within rather than interstate relations at the global level. So this presentation is based on an article I've written with Professor Jan Bedvinisti, and in this article we challenge the canonical narrative about civil society's efforts to discipline warfare during the mid-19th century, a narrative of progressive evolution, of some kind of an Enlightenment-inspired laws of war, later to be termed international humanitarian law. Conversely, our historical account shows how the debate over humanitarian law is actually a debate over participation in international lawmaking and over the content of this law, and that debate reflected social and political tensions within and between European states. While the multifaceted influence of civil society was an important catalyst for this codification of the laws of war, the content of that codification did not simply reflect humanitarian sensibilities. Rather, a civil society posed a threat to the governmental monopoly over the regulation of war. Actually, this turn to interstate codification of the laws of war assisted governmental elite in securing their authority as the sole regulators in the international terrain. We argue that, just the thrust of the argument is that the codification of the laws of war, in that codification, the main concern of key European governments was not to protect civilians from combatants' fire, but rather to protect combatants from civilians too eager to take up arms to defend their nation, even against their own government's wishes. So the puzzle that we're working with is what prompted the European governments of the 19th century to internationally codify the laws of war. Why did they constrain themselves in that specific manner and at that particular moment? The canon, as I said, is usually a canon that tells the story of kind of a humanitarian sensibility advocated by civil society. So this is an example from one of the textbooks. Ted Moran, really a very important and prominent scholar of international humanitarian law. Calamitous events and atrocities have always driven the development of international humanitarian law. The Battle of Solferino, 1863, inspired the Red Cross movement, the Geneva Law, which emphasizes the protections of the victims of war, the sick, the wounded, prisoners, and civilians. So this is the canonical narrative against which that we are trying to challenge or at least revisit. So the canon really focuses on this Battle of Solferino. These are the heroes of that story. Gustave Monnier, who would later be one of the founders of the International International, the institute that codified international law, and Henri Dunant, who's really the figure, the main figure behind the Red Cross, at least formally speaking. And our idea is to, against this kind of narrative, to suggest that it's not really humanitarian sensibilities, but actually the threat of democracy to governing elite, and the use that triggered the use of international law to monopolize war and to tame civil society. Our argument competes with other theoretical perspectives. Realists who perceive codification of the laws of war as a result, or as an attempt to address reciprocity between armies, or kind of cosmopolitan approaches that are more tuned to these humanitarian sensibilities, to realist approaches that would tell the story as a story of imperial governments. Our story is somewhere in between the realist and the institutionalist perspective, because we actually disaggregate these European forces and states. We don't look at this story as an interstate story that's been negotiated in some rooms behind closed doors with a lot of smoke and of cigars and other things, but actually this is a story of grassroots unrest, civil society trying to be more powerful through these various democratization processes in Europe, and the ways in which these forces are being tamed or curtailed by governing elites through the vehicle of international law. So in order to explain the kind of threat that was underpinning this story, we look at the Crimea War as really a very, very important turning point for a story. So the Crimea War as a watershed from its early days was a media war. The press in this story, through extensive reporting, photography, considerable growth in circulation, played a particularly central role. It was a war that was experienced through cultural documentation, not only after the fact, but as events were unfolding and transpiring. One particularly famous journalist was Leo Tolstoy, who's here on our stage. He spent much of the war writing dispatches for the contemporary, vividly conveying the general sense among soldiers of war being futile. Tolstoy's reporting in the contemporary was part of a broader phenomenon in which war became the people's war because of new communication technologies. So another aspect that made this war the public war was really the transition of small professional armies of the past generation that were now replaced by hordes of inexperienced soldiers. So not only was the war brought home by journalists and the press, it was also brought home by one's father, brother, and cousin, who were now part of the war itself and were wounded, or if they ever came home. So these kind of mass media reports of the British soldiers who stood in defiance of Russian aggression, their heroic tales of great sacrifice, and the humanitarian devotion of for instance, Florence Nightingale during the war in her profession, served to criticize the military and army in real time, and exposed for the first time the potential impact of public opinion on the course of war and peace. So the Crimean War marked a turning point in military history as armies grew bigger, employing inexperienced soldiers drafted against their will, and also because it was the first war that really was subject to civil society's scrutiny in real time. The neat separation between military and civil society could no longer be maintained. We see technological development like the telegraph that was used for the first time during that period, facilitating unprecedented coverage of action in the battlefield. Not far behind the journalist was the common soldiers whose letters to the press, his suffering and his incompetence of himself and the military were all brought to bear in these publications. So the media coverage of the Crimean War and the involvement of citizens as conscript journalists and volunteers translated into political pressures that governments could ill afford to ignore. A very important ideological component of that kind of transition of war into public war was the nationalism. Nationalism during this period is perceived by many as a threat because it's a source of public critique and because soldiers who are now fighting as the fighters of their nations were oftentimes too eager to pursue the war, even when their commanders were hoping to halt a battle. So nationalism was both a means for galvanizing support, but also was something that needed to be constrained. And later on, when European armies would turn to national conscription, they would use nationalism to enhance national identity, but they would be very conscious of its threatening component, that aspect of being too eager to pursue the war because of nationalist sensibility. All of this, usually as the story is told, all of this and other developments really lead to the first Geneva Conventions of 1864. So this was kind of in some of the narratives of the period, this was the culmination of this public unrest and critique over human suffering and undue and soldiers who weren't cared for during the war. Yet, despite the public outcry, the Geneva Convention did not require the military to invest resources in caring for the wounded and sick, nor was it concerned with the promotion of peace or the conduct of armies during the war. So unlike the approach of the British during the Crimean War, which led to the establishment of official medical services within the army, the main thrust of the initiators of the Geneva Convention was to bestow on voluntary aid society the status of neutrals. And the convention really relied on civil society to tend to soldiers. This was also the first and last international conference where the civil society was part and parcel of the drafting process on par with governmental representatives. So there wasn't a real distinction between a representative of the government and a civil society agent in that respect. But this would be the last occasion during the 19th century on which civil society activists will actually be permitted to set the agenda and initiate codification. From the St. Petersburg, from the St. Petersburg Declaration, which will be right after, and onwards, governments would preempt civil society initiatives and exclude their members from participation in the drafting process. So, public outcry is very much at present. Democratic processes are taking place, and yet European governments are not keen to do much about the international laws of war. In the St. Petersburg Declaration, they really prohibit so little and allowed so much that they demonstrate their meager willingness or even reluctance of governments to constrain themselves on the battlefield. So what happens next? Why do suddenly European governments decide to constrain themselves and codify the laws of war that would now dictate what they can and cannot do in the battlefield? So that's a real historical puzzle. The idea of government constraining themselves vis-a-vis one another, I don't think it's something that can be taken lightly. So why did they do that? And part of the reason has to do with the Franco-Prussian War. How much time do we have? I can
almost 5 minutes.
5 minutes. So
Actually, I mean, a little over 5 minutes. Sorry.
A little over. Okay.
I'll allow for 1 minute slippage.
Okay.
Because you disrupt her, so you should.
Well, she asked. So
I asked.
Now you're disrupting her.
Okay, so the Franco-Prussian War begins in July 1817. It should have ended very quickly, right? So really, very quickly thereafter, we see the surrender. Napoleon is captured and exiled, but it really doesn't end there. What we then have is a two-phase of kind of uprising of the French against their defeated government. First, calls for revolution against the French monarchy immediately spread across the country, and on the 4th of September 1870, Léon Gambetta proclaims the founding of the Government of National Defense. So this government was determined to continue the war throughout France. But instead of relying on the defeated army, and that's a very important fact, historical fact for our purposes, the Republican authorities rallied the National Guard, a proletarian force of about 200,000, who were paid very little per day, and flancs-tireurs, who were free shooters. And these were volunteer, irregular fighters from different political and social backgrounds throughout France, who operated against advancing Prussian troops, as well as against their lines of communication in occupied territory, sometimes as guerrilla forces, and at other times in support of regular forces in the open. So in significant numbers, really answered and responded to Gambetta's call. Everyone, let us rise en masse and die rather than submit to the shame of national disembarment. So we see that kind of spirit of uprising in that phase. That phase also, I'll skip that a little bit, they were the People's Army. That's how they were conceived. We see some of the and they were really treated very harshly by the German army. The winter of 1970 was particularly harsh, and eventually they surrender. They surrender, but that's not where our story ends.
The French Commune.
The French Commune, and the French Commune is really the main issue here. So the Paris Commune of 1871 is really another element of the story that's often being overlooked because it's supposedly an internal issue. But what we try to argue that it actually, the Parisians who were outvoted in the National Assembly, they refused to give up their arms. Well, this was a very short-lived revolutionary commune. It sprang up in other cities beyond the capital. But even though it was short-lived, it presented a serious challenge to the European leaders in the following decades. So first of all, they had elections, okay, and they they had established other communes along France. Women and children were helping to take, they were part of the armed forces. Here we see how the Germans encircle Paris, how they prepare themselves for the attack, okay, and the kind of the spirit of the commune. Even with no hope of victory, Paris had to defend itself so that the homeland might live. So we see both the kind of democratic and nationalist sensibilities operate in tandem.
But there wasn't a threat of secession, right? Because they wanted to protect the homeland. They saw themselves as part of France. They weren't threatening to.
No,
leave France.
They were against the surrender itself. Yes, and also they posed a challenge to existing social and economic and the political order in many respects. They advocated separation of church and state, limiting social welfare ideas, secular education. Women joined fighting. Okay, we see it here. I'm almost done. And of course, overnight, Marx, Archie, who was really celebrating the Commune of universal notoriety as the Red Terrorist doctor. Okay, eventually the Commune would collapse, but in its aftermath, what we would see is the complete exclusion of civil society from any intrusion or influence on codification processes in international legal codification, and the lead would be taken over by international lawyers and away from grassroots and non-trained lawyers or non-professional NGOs who were trying to get to become influential. So the kind of I guess the argument is here kind of conveyed very clearly by Eric Hobsbawm. The Paris Commune frightened the wits of the bourgeoisie order by its mere existence. And what we will see later, and I don't have time to elaborate on that, is the Brussels Declaration. So the codification processes that this process had ushered in are actually codification processes that were meant to tame these very forces that we see in the Paris Commune. So generally speaking, it is no longer the ambition of monarchs which endangers peace, but the impulses of a nation. So what government elites were conceiving as the threat to their rule was not really monarchs who are threatening them, but bottom-up nationalist sentiments. And they would not allow civil society inside their negotiation table. And to conclude that the Brussels Declaration had these 4 pillars. It would not regulate civil war up until very late. So civil war was kind of excluded from the scope of codification of international law. Civilians will not be protected in the battlefield at that point. The occupation regime which we live, that codification is actually the codification of The Hague, and we live with that codification until this very day, is based on a pact between elites, and this pact offered very little protection from the harms of war. Yes, I'm concluding to my last slide. Yeah, I thought this would happen. Okay, so our idea was to suggest that the codification of the laws of war as part of international law was really not a result of some kind of a humanitarian sensibility that was then ushered by governing elites to celebrate the human spirit, but rather the attempt of governments to use international law for their needs to rein in their own soldiers and civilians.
Thank you very much. Okay, so this is actually an